Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel on healthy aging. We will all be presenting our slides, and then we will make sure we leave plenty of time for question and answers. So this is the Healthy Aging panel. I'm Dr. Masaki. I'm the chair of the Department of Geriatric Medicine at the John A. Burns School of Medicine. Dr. Colette Browne is an emeritus professor at the Thompson School of Social Work. Dr. Virginia Hinshaw is Chancellor and Professor Emeritus. And Susie Chun-Oakland is with Catholic Charities, and she's a retired Hawaiʻi state senator and representative. So I'm very honored to have this wonderful group of ladies speaking today. These are today's topics. We'll be talking about aging in the United States and the geriatrics approach to care, a little bit about women and healthy aging, the positive effects of aging, and then senior centers to promote active aging and independence. So I'm going to start out with this question. What is geriatrics? And I'm going to answer it with this cartoon. The older gentleman says, "Judy, do you see that elderly couple down at the other end of the counter?" And she says, "Yeah, what about them?" And he says, "I was just thinking that's probably what you and I will look like in about 10 years or so." And she says, "You do realize that's a mirror at the end of the counter, don't you?" So I always say geriatrics is 10 years older than you are right at this moment. But getting serious, geriatrics is the care of older patients. And traditionally, this age was set at 65 years and older. Now remember, this age cutoff was set in the 1930s. This is when Social Security first came into being. And we know that at that time, not too many people lived to be 65. So at that time, they said, if you live to the extreme old age of 65, we will reward you with Social Security. And later, Medicare came in as well with that age. Now we know 65 years is certainly not very old. In fact, in my group, among geriatricians, we say somebody who's 65 and healthy, we call that pediatrics. We don't think that they really need a geriatrician. Currently, geriatrics is a critical shortage specialty. It's actually a federally designated critical shortage specialty. They've estimated that there are 30,000 geriatricians needed in the US right now. We have less than 7,000. And while the number of older people is going up, the number of geriatricians is actually decreasing every year. So for many practical reasons, geriatrics is currently mostly care of the very frail elderly. We don't take care of mostly people in their 60s. We take care of people in their 80s and 90s and even beyond, or people of any age who have a lot of frailty or who have dementia. That's one of the things we specialize in. So this is the US older population, and here on this x-axis, we have time. So this starts out with 1900 and goes all the way here. We're right about here in the 1920s, and this is projected out to 2050. And you can see this blue line here is people over the age of 65. So you can see a very steady growth over the century. And then here around 2010, you can see this curve actually got steeper. And this is when the baby boomers hit 65. And you can see that for about 20 years, this is going to be a steeper rise, and then it'll level out again. This green line on the bottom is people over the age of 85. So not only are more people living to older ages, 65 and older, it's way more into 85 and older. In fact, the 85 and older population is the fastest growing segment of the population and has been for the last several decades. Where does Hawaii stand? Well, I was actually surprised to see this, but until the mid-1990s, Hawaii's percentage of older population was actually lower than the national average. We have the state of Hawaii in orange and the United States in this magenta purple color. And you can see somewhere in the mid-90s, that's when we switched, and then Hawaii became higher than the national average. And now we are certainly growing at a much faster rate. And currently, Hawaii has the highest life expectancy of all states in the United States. A lot of this is because of our different ethnic groups, many of our Asian groups. So again, here red is women and blue is men. And Chinese women in particular live a very, very, very long time. And then Japanese is close behind, then other than Filipino. Caucasians, in most studies on the mainland, Caucasians tend to have the highest life expectancy. In Hawaii, they actually have one of the lower life expectancies because many of the Asian populations have a higher life expectancy. Unfortunately, there's still health disparities, and Native Hawaiians do have the lowest life expectancy, and that's a lot of work that needs to be done to try and even that score. So again, in every ethnic group and at every point in time, women have outlived men. So women, we're starting to feel pretty good, right? But it's not all our way. So men, there's some good news for you too. When we look at physical disability over the age of 70, you can see women who are in red, 30% of them will have, almost 30% will have a disability after the age of 70 compared to only 20% of men. So even though women live longer, we're also more likely to be frail. Here, this is disability and activities of daily living. This is things like bathing and dressing and grooming, things we do all the time. Again, women more than men. And these are the instrumental activities of daily living. This is things like taking your medications, balancing your checkbook, cooking, cleaning, that kind of thing. Again, women tend to have more disability than men do. So these are some of the characteristics of aging. Older people, unfortunately, are more susceptible to disease. But it's not only genetics. Environmental factors are also an influence on the rate of aging. So the things we do matter. It's not just our genes. There is a lot of variability among the older population. So if we take a group of 80-year-olds and compare anything, heart function, lung function, kidney function, we'll have all ends of the spectrum. We'll have some who are completely normal and then some who have very bad disability and everything in between. Not so much when we do younger populations. And the ability to maintain what we call homeostasis. This is sort of keeping balance. This is when you go outside and it's very hot and you're sweating and you're losing liquids and then you drink to rehydrate yourself. That's your body taking care of itself to maintain this balance or homeostasis. In older people, this ability is not as good as it was when they were younger. We also see atypical presentations in older people. So I always say geriatrician is a little bit like a detective. It's not clear sometimes exactly what's happening. Sometimes older patients will just present with a functional decline. They'll have falls or confusion or weight loss or incontinence, but you're really not sure what's going on. Is it pneumonia? Is it a heart attack? It could be a bunch of different things. We see misleading symptoms. We see patients with a rip-roaring pneumonia. Pneumonia is a bad infection of the lungs, but they don't have a fever. Why is that? Because the body cannot mount that fever. And sometimes we have no presenting symptoms. So patients can have a heart attack or a stroke and have no symptoms at all. We find out later on when we do an EKG or when we do a CAT scan that, oh, something must have happened before they had an event.
But her life was challenged. And so I think her lifespan was actually pretty impressive. Her life story was one of limited education, a missing and then an abusive husband, multiple children, and economic strife throughout her life. As a clinician and academic researcher, I've spent the last 35 years or so talking to people like my grandmother and other older men and women. Topics like the aging process, how we feel about aging, how we feel about the aging of others, how aging is viewed differently by different populations, what are the most pressing concerns, what's the role of policy in healthcare. All of this was great interest to me and remains so. What I've come to learn, and now about myself as well, as I am also older, that for men and women, what everyone wants is the same, and that's comfort, security, and dignity. If we could have slide 2. This talk, though, is about women because the truth is comfort, security, and dignity. It's really hard for women as they get older to reach these. And why is that? When I think about my own grandmothers, one lived a long life and the other died earlier from cancer. Both had challenges, but very different ones. What I've learned from my work and what has been validated by research is that older women, in fact, do have some very real concerns. So our focus today, even though men and women both age, our focus will be on older women. Now, in every nation, women live longer than men. In most mammal species, also, women live longer. Girls live older, even to the first year of age. And there truly is some type of female survival advantage. But there's much that we have to learn still from biology. But I'm not a biologist, so I'm going to talk more from a demographic and more from a social science perspective. In the US alone, there are more older women than older men by 6 million. About 70% of the 85 and over population are women. But there's also some advantages to living longer. We all know that. Besides longevity, women have stronger social networks. They keep their networks, their social relationships, their friends closer. And we're learning how important that is to not be socially isolated. But there's disadvantages too. Income, healthcare, the absence of long-term care services, and of course, the fact that women are primarily caregivers. Now, I think you'd probably agree with me that there's nothing wrong with caregiving. The problem is when it impacts our health and our economic status, and when it leaves women especially vulnerable to service gaps. Now, before I focus more on our topic today for the next 5 minutes or so, just a real quick caveat, and that is that what we've learned about sex and aging and gender and aging are really undeveloped topics. And we've also learned that gender is not so much a binary, but it's complicated, it's a spectrum. Our research isn't up to date yet, but I'm very optimistic it will be more inclusive in the future. What we're seeing then is that there are gender inequities that shape opportunities from birth until we die. Could we have slide 3? So this focus is on gender and aging, and it's also the one on inequality. Now there's a framework that gerontologists and others often use, and it's called life course. And this really just speaks to that long view of aging, that we don't become old on our 65th, our 65th, our 70th birthday, but rather it's a process that what happens in our earlier years very much impacts what happens when we're older. And of course, it isn't just our own life history, but it's what's happening around us. And if we did not understand that concept with COVID-19, we certainly now do understand how what's happening outside of us so much impacts our life. If we can have the next slide. Now, I think what's really interesting and also alarming, quite frankly, is if you look at the global picture, is that gender inequality exists in every country. There is no country where women now are equal to men in various aspects of health and education, political influence, and so forth. So reports from the World Bank, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Forum, major reports that look at global pictures of women really are, as I just said, alarming. Women continue to have less income and be paid less than men. The economic gap, according to the World Economic Forum, will take another 200 years to close. That there is some improved gender parity in education, but not in political power. And certainly we see some improvements in our country, but we still have a ways to go. The family remains the domain with the most persistent gender roles, and discrimination and violence against women exists in every nation, and sadly is on the rise in those with growing conservative movements, for example, Spain, France, Turkey, and Russia. If we can have the next slide. So what I wanted to do was to talk about income. Now, I think all of you would probably agree with me that income alone does not make a happy life, but we also know that without an adequate income, our opportunity for access to healthcare, to decent housing, to transportation, to nutritional food, all of things that Dr. Misaki talked about that were so important are very, very difficult to do when there really isn't adequate income. So what I wanted to do now is just take a minute or so to look at the economic status of older women and men here in Hawaii. So we'll leave that global picture and really take a look more at Hawaii. And if we can have the next slide. So the gender gap, as I just said, leads to the retirement gap. And what we're looking at are trying to prevent today's younger women from becoming what we see now in our data. So we want to eliminate that gender wage gap. We want to look at the unequal distribution of care responsibilities, the high cost and unavailability of elder and child care. And we're hoping that the present administration is going to do something about this. Discrimination and gender-based violence and limited affordable housing. You know, what a difference it would make to younger women who are only tomorrow's older women if all of these things are addressed. But midlife and older women also face limited job opportunities, occupational segregation, poor health, and again, that issue of long-term services that keeps coming up, and gender-based violence, again, the increase in elder abuse, especially against older women. And all of these are barriers when you put them all together for secure old age for women. The lack of family policy funding and options, again, healthcare and long-term care, that policy inertia that we so much do not pay attention to issues related to older women. President Biden's new commission on gender equity, which just came out yesterday, I believe. It's an excellent report, but there's very little information on older women. I urge you to read it. And the lack of safety at home, in the community, and at work. Next slide. So, you know, my grandson, every time I ask him what we should do, he always says, "What the heck?" So I felt like really saying, rather than what we can all do, what the heck? What do we do with all this information? Well, I think the most important thing that we've learned is to vote, support those who believe women matter, and ask those questions and make sure that they believe that. To advocate for a just vision for society. This should go for everyone. We should be respectful of cultural and gender variations. What about better legislation to increase gender and end the pay gap? You know, we're one of the few countries that really doesn't do things like even making income transparent, and how important that would be. How do you know if you're underpaid if that is not made available to you? Support for older women. It kind of drives me crazy, to be honest, when I see reports about gender equality and there's no mention of protection of Social Security or the issue of long-term care. These are critical issues for everyone, but especially older women. Ending all forms of gender-based violence. Again, elder abuse against women is gender-based violence. And proportionate gender care, child and elder care. You know, we're one of only 6 countries that don't allow child and elder care leave and affordable child care. You know, we really have to change this if we want women back in the workforce. Again, COVID has really highlighted, hasn't it, what's happening with women here. And lastly, I think be a mentor and be mentored. Young people are fabulous. They are, my daughters are always correcting me with some ideas I have, which no longer should be ideas that I have in my head. So listen to younger people, listen to their concerns about the environment, about climate change, about gender roles, about social justice, about race issues. They have a great deal, I think, to talk to us about.
Well, aloha. I'm delighted to join y'all this evening. And I chose the topic, positive effects of aging, because I really believe that's true. But unfortunately, that's not what you hear a lot about. There are a lot of negative messages, misery myths, I call those, where we'll be feeble, confused, unhappy, lonely, useless, and the list goes on. And we hear it in the social media and the press. But I'm here today to give you some information that I think counters a good bit of this. I'm going to review findings that support the positive effects of aging based on research, discuss physical changes that actually improve our lives, and emphasize the importance of attitude. Now, aging, first of all, is not a disease. Aging is a natural and universal process. We do it from the day we're born. Now, diseases are deviations from the normal state, and I will talk somewhat about that because we face that as we age, as Kamal mentioned. But I like what Maxine has to say. She says, don't get all weird about getting older. Our age is merely the number of years the world has been enjoying us. So keep that in mind at all times. Now let's talk a little bit about perception versus reality. And these are based on research studies, and there are a number of them. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. But perception can be very different from reality, and particularly in regard to aging. Look at all the negative stereotypes: our memory loss, can't drive, sick, inactive, sadness, all these lists of negative stereotypes for aging. And then let's look at who expects that. The 18 to 64-year-olds, they actually expect a lot of that to happen when they turn 65. That is their expectation. Then let's ask the experts, the experience of people who are 65 and over. And it's a totally different picture here. Now, there are certain times we do have these, so it's not zero. But look at the difference, like 57% to 25%. The experts, people who are living at 65 and over, they have a very different reality. And I think that's really important. Perception does not match reality. And in another study, they looked at who was thriving. And I love that term, thriving. And they asked different age groups. And the 65 plus, that's the one on the bottom here, at the bottom of each section. But look, social, community, financial, physical, we're all thriving more than any of the other groups in every category. We're listing people 65 and over and say they are thriving. Now that's not 100%, as we know, but clearly the majority are doing that. And when you get to the physical, it gets a little bit closer. And that's kind of to be expected in a lot of ways, because one of the things that happens as we age, we have to deal with change. And aging does require us to transition through many changes. Some we like, some we don't. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the fears that I've heard and concerns from people over the years. And certainly two of the major ones is having declining mental activities or abilities, and that's the brain. Also having increasing health challenges for the body. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those two aspects. Now there's good news about the brain, the transition of an aging brain. The brain continually resculpts itself in response to experience and learning. That's the reason you need to be a lifelong learner and also have lots of experiences that stimulate your brain. You also get new brain cells all the time. It doesn't stop when you're 20. Throughout your life, you will be generating new brain cells. And an important one is the emotional circuitry. It matures and becomes more balanced with age. And that's partly because we're using both sides of our brains, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But that's very notable in scans. This is all documented. It's just opinion. They looked at these issues. And so actually there's good news about our brains. Oopsie. Okay, I want to talk about a young brain versus an old brain. A young brain looks kind of like this tree over here without many branches or leaves because they haven't had much experience or learning. Now they can get to an answer really fast because, did my picture go away? Oops, okay. They can get there really fast because they don't have to make many connections. And then look at this beautiful older brain over here. This one, oh, start my video. Did I go off? Okay. This is a beautiful brain. This is an old brain. Lots of leaves, lots of branches. Now it's pretty full, kind of like a hard drive that's gotten full. So it takes us longer to get connected. We have to go through lots of connections to find the answer to something. And so that can take us a little longer, but the good news is we get there. And that's what you should keep in mind. It's actually, what you're doing is building wisdom. That's what that old brain has from experience and learning. Now, about using both hemispheres of your brain, the left brain versus the right brain, we hear a lot about that. The left brain is the logical, mathematical side, and typically deals with those type of activities. The right brain is creative, intuitive. And what happens as we age is we start going back and forth more. And that helps us develop compassion because we see more sides of issues. And we're bringing in our feeling side as well as our analytical side. In addition, musicians have even better brains because their corpus callosum, which attaches these two, is larger than most people. So it's developing skills. They're going back and forth all the time. Now, there is one area of the brain, the amygdala, which decreases in activity as we age. Little two glands, groups of cells in the back of your brain. But that's actually good because because it's the center of fear, anger, and hatred. So as we age, that goes down in activity. So we mellow. And we increasingly react to the positive more than the negative. So these are actually beneficial changes in our brains as we age. Now, health challenges. I said I'd talk a little bit about disease, and I'll use myself as an example. When I first started out, I looked like this card, no dents, no damage, looks really great. Now, after 77 years, I look a little bit more like this on occasion. I've been using the equipment longer, and so therefore I need a lot more repairs and maintenance. And that is a common situation for us as we age. And most of us have what I call the list of ailments. So this is a short list of mine. I'm not a paragon of health. I had wonderful parents who had some not so wonderful diseases. So I deal with all these, but I really think this is where you talk about attitude. And I like this woman's attitude where she just goes, got to move on. Can't spend all your time on this list.